The dust-laden air shimmered with heat as Faith Zimmerman stumbled down the main street of Raton, New Mexico territory, her once fine dress hanging loosely from her gaunt frame. 3 days without food had drained the color from her cheeks and the strength from her limbs. The promised land of the West had delivered nothing but heartbreak since the stagecoach robbery that had left her penniless and alone. As the world tilted sideways before her eyes, the weathered porch of Porter's General Store became her final destination before darkness claimed her. April 1885 had been unusually hot, even for this corner of the territory. The townsfolk bustling along the thoroughfare barely noticed the young woman until her body hit the wooden planks with a thud that seemed to echo in the still afternoon air. A crowd began to gather, murmuring with concern but maintaining a cautious distance. Among them stood Archer Whitley, his broad shoulders and weathered Stetson casting a long shadow across the unconscious woman. Unlike the spectators who merely gawked, he pushed through the crowd with purposeful strides. "Give her some air," he commanded, his voice carrying the natural authority of a man accustomed to being heated. Kneeling beside the fallen woman, he gently turned her face toward him. Despite the layer of trail dust, he could see she was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features that spoke of genteel upbringing rather than frontier hardship. "Someone fetch Doc Miller," he called out, but even as a boy ran to comply, Archer made his decision. The doctor's office was at the far end of town, and this woman needed immediate attention. With careful movements, he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a child. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel the alarming prominence of her ribs through the fabric of her dress. "You planning on taking her to the doctor?" asked Harold Porter, the storekeeper who had emerged at the commotion. "My place is closer," Archer replied simply. "Tell the doc to meet me there." Without waiting for further comment, he began walking purposefully down the street, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed. Archer Whitley was not a man who sought attention, but neither was he one to shy away from doing what needed to be done. His ranch house stood a quarter-mile from the edge of town, close enough for convenience, but far enough to afford privacy. It was modest but well-maintained, a testament to his belief that a man's home should reflect his character. As he approached the front porch, the door swung open to reveal Mrs. Abernathy, his housekeeper, her face a picture of alarm. "Good heavens, Mr. Whitley, what's happened?" "Found her collapsed outside Porter's," he explained tersely. "She needs help, food, and rest. Prepare the spare room, Mrs. Abernathy, a widow who had come west following her husband's death in the war between the states, was not a woman easily flustered. With efficient movements, she led the way to the small but neat guest room, turning down the bed covers so Archer could lay his burden gently upon the mattress. "She's burning up," Mrs. Abernathy noted, placing a palm against the young woman's forehead. "I'll fetch cool water and cloths." Archer nodded, stepping back to allow his housekeeper room to work. He found himself studying the unconscious woman more carefully now. Her honey-brown hair had come loose from its pins, framing a face that might have been beautiful were it not so drawn with hunger and exhaustion. Her hands, though dirty from her fall, showed no calluses, not the hands of someone accustomed to labor. "Who do you suppose she is, Mrs. Abernathy asked as she returned with a basin of water and began bathing the dust from the woman's face. "No idea," Archer replied, "but I aim to find out when she wakes." The sound of hoofbeats announced the arrival of Doc Miller, a grizzled veteran of both the war and the frontier. After a thorough examination, his diagnosis was simple but grave. "Exhaustion, dehydration, and malnutrition," he pronounced. "Nothing that can't be fixed with proper care, but she's been pushing herself beyond human limits." He turned to Archer with a searching look. "You taking responsibility for her?" Archer hesitated only briefly. "For now, at least until she's well enough to tell us her story." The doctor nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. "Start with broth, nothing solid for at least a day. Keep her cool and quiet. I'll check back tomorrow." As the doctor departed, Archer found himself alone with his housekeeper and the mysterious woman who had literally fallen into his care. "I'll sit with her," Mrs. Abernathy offered. "You've got the ranch to run." "Thank you, Ruth," he said, using her first name as he rarely did. "But fetch me if she wakes. I'd like to hear what brought her to this state." The remainder of the day passed in its usual rhythm of ranch work, though Archer found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to the woman in his guest room. At 30 years of age, he had long ago accepted that his life would likely be solitary. The ranch consumed his time and energy, leaving little for socializing, and the few women in the territory suitable for courting had never stirred his interest beyond polite conversation. Yet something about this stranger's plight had touched him in a way he hadn't expected. Perhaps it was merely basic human compassion, or perhaps it was something more, a recognition of vulnerability that called to something protective in his nature. It was nearly dusk when Mrs. Abernathy found him in the barn, checking on a mare who had recently foaled. "She's awake," the housekeeper announced without preamble, and asking questions. Archer straightened, brushing straw from his clothing. "How is she?" "Weak as a newborn kitten but lucid." "Took some broth without trouble." The older woman paused, a hint of amusement crossing her weathered features. "And she's mighty concerned about the propriety of being in a strange man's home." This brought a rare smile to Archer's face. "Well, we can't have her reputation compromised. Assure her of your respectable presence." When he entered the guest room, having paused only long enough to wash his hands and face, Archer found his patient propped against several pillows, her eyes a striking shade of amber regarding him warily. "Mr. Whitley," she acknowledged, her voice soft but surprisingly steady. "Miss," he replied with a slight nod. "I'm glad to see you awake. You gave the town quite a scare." A flush of embarrassment colored her pale cheeks. "I must apologize for the trouble I've caused, Mrs. Abernathy tells me you carried me from the street." "No trouble," he assured her, remaining standing near the doorway to preserve proper distance. "Though I admit to some curiosity about what brought a young lady to such straits in Raton." She hesitated, her fingers plucking nervously at the quilt covering her. "My name is Faith Zimmerman. I was traveling from Philadelphia to Santa Fe, where my uncle had arranged employment for me as a schoolteacher." Her voice faltered. "The stagecoach was robbed 3 days ago near Zimmerman. The driver was killed, and they took everything: my trunk, my reticule with all my money. They left the passengers stranded." Archer frowned. "The Zimmerman gang. They've been growing bolder." He'd heard reports of the robberies, but this was the first victim he'd encountered personally. "How did you reach Raton on foot?" "I walked," she replied simply. "The other passengers were continuing west, but I needed to reach a telegraph office to contact my uncle. I thought I could make it." Her hands trembled slightly. "I had no food, just a little water from streams. By the time I reached town, I don't remember much after seeing the general store." The story was unfortunately common in the territory. Eastern travelers, unprepared for the harsh realities of frontier life, left vulnerable to the elements and outlaws alike. What was uncommon was the fortitude this slip of a woman had shown, walking for days through rugged country with no provisions. "You're safe now," he said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his tone. "Rest and recover your strength. We can discuss your next steps when you're feeling better." Relief washed visibly across her features. "Thank you. I have no way to repay your kindness immediately, but once I contact my uncle," Archer raised a hand, cutting off her words. "There's no need for payment, Miss Zimmerman. Helping travelers in distress is simply what's done out here. We all depend on each other's humanity in this country." That night, as he sat on his porch watching darkness settle over the land, Archer considered the twist of fate that had brought Faith Zimmerman to his doorstep. Tomorrow, he would send a telegram to her uncle in Santa Fe, informing him of her situation. Once arrangements were made, she would continue her journey, and his life would return to its familiar patterns. Yet something in him resisted this tidy resolution. There was a quiet dignity in the way she had faced her misfortune, a resilience that commanded respect. In the brief conversation they'd shared, he'd glimpsed an intelligence and determination that intrigued him. Morning brought a noticeable improvement in Faith's condition. When Archer looked in on her before heading to town, he found her sitting in a chair by the window, her hair neatly braided and her borrowed dress, one of Mrs. Abernathy's, significantly altered, giving her a more substantial appearance than the day before. "You're looking better," he observed. She offered a small smile that transformed her face, bringing warmth to features that had seemed fragile only hours before. "I feel almost human again. Mrs. Abernathy is a miracle worker and an excellent cook." "That she is," he agreed. "I'm heading into town to send a telegram to your uncle." "What's his name and address?" Her smile faltered slightly. "Frederick Zimmerman, Santa Fe. He's the superintendent of schools there." She hesitated. "Mr. Whitley, I hate to impose further, but might I accompany you? I've been such a burden, and I'd like to begin making arrangements myself." Archer considered her request, noting the color that had returned to her cheeks, but also the lingering weakness in her posture. "Doc Miller said you need at least 3 days of rest before traveling." "I won't overexert myself," she promised. "But sitting in this room, being waited upon it, doesn't sit right with me. I was raised to manage my own affairs." There was a quiet pride in her voice that resonated with Archer's own values. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "We'll take the buggy. But at the first sign of fatigue, we return immediately." The ride into town gave Archer his first opportunity to observe Faith Zimmerman in a more natural state. Away from the sicked, animated by the fresh morning air, she revealed a lively curiosity about her surroundings, asking intelligent questions about the territory, the ranch, and the town itself. "How long have you been in Raton?" she inquired as they passed the outlying farms that bordered his property. 7 years, he replied. "Came west after the war, worked cattle drives for a spell, then saved enough to buy my own place." "You fought in the war?" Her question was tentative, recognizing the sensitivity that still surrounded the conflict 20 years later. "Union cavalry," he confirmed. "Though out here, a man's allegiances during those years matter less than what he builds afterward." She nodded thoughtfully. "My father was a doctor in Philadelphia. He treated soldiers from both sides. He always said suffering doesn't recognize uniform color." The observation surprised him with its wisdom. "Your father sounds like a sensible man." "He was," she said softly. "He and my mother both died in the influenza outbreak 3 years ago. That's when I trained as a teacher. It seemed the most practical profession for a woman alone." The telegraph office in Raton occupied a corner of the railroad station, a relatively new building that represented the town's growing importance as a transportation hub. As they entered, several townspeople nodded to Archer with respect while regarding Faith with undisguised curiosity. The telegram to Santa Fe was quickly composed and sent, with Archer insisting on covering the cost, despite Faith's protests. While they waited for a potential reply, he suggested they visit Porter's General Store to purchase some necessities for her. "I can't accept more charity," Faith objected as they stood outside the establishment where she had collapsed the previous day. "Not charity," Archer corrected. "A loan, if you prefer. Once you're situated in Santa Fe, you can repay me." This compromise seemed to satisfy her sense of propriety, and she nodded agreement. Inside the store, Harold Porter greeted them with evident surprise. "Well, miss, you're looking considerably improved from yesterday. Glad to see Mr. Whitley's care has been beneficial." Faith's cheeks colored slightly at the implied intimacy, but she responded with composure. "Mrs. Abernathy has been most attentive, sir, and I must thank you for allowing me to create such a disturbance in front of your establishment," Porter chuckled. "First time someone's fainted on my doorstep, but I reckon it won't be the last in this heat." With Archer's assistance, Faith selected a modest but practical collection of items: 2 ready-made calico dresses that would require only minor alterations, undergarments, a hairbrush, and personal necessities. Throughout the process, he noted her careful consideration of each purchase, selecting for durability rather than adornment. Their final stop was the hotel restaurant, where Archer insisted Faith take a proper meal before returning to the ranch. As they waited for their food, he noticed her growing pallor and the slight trembling of her hands. "We should head back after this," he suggested. "You've done enough for your first outing." She nodded, clearly too exhausted to maintain her earlier pretense of strength. "You were right about needing more recovery time. I find myself embarrassingly weak." "Nothing embarrassing about needing time to heal," he said. The body has its own wisdom. Their meal was interrupted by the arrival of a telegraph messenger who delivered a response from Santa Fe. Faith's hands trembled as she opened the paper, and Archer watched her face carefully as she read the contents. The color drained from her cheeks, and she swayed slightly in her seat. "Bad news," he asked quietly. She handed him the telegram wordlessly. The message was brief, but devastating. "Regret to inform position filled stop unable to provide assistance stop letter explaining follows stop F. Zimmerman." "I see," Archer said, carefully controlling his reaction to keep from increasing her distress. "This changes your immediate plans, but it's not insurmountable." Faith stared at her plate, her food barely touched. "I have no position, no funds, and now no family to assist me. It seems my situation is indeed quite mountable, Mr. Whitley." Despite the gravity of the moment, Archer found himself appreciating her flash of spirit. The position in Santa Fe may be gone, but Raton has been growing rapidly since the railroad came through. They've been discussing the need for another teacher at the town school. Hope flickered briefly in her eyes before doubt extinguished it. "Even if that were true, I have no references here, no way to establish my qualifications, and nowhere to stay while seeking employment." "You have a place to stay," he said firmly. "My home is at your disposal until you're on your feet. As for references, I'm on the town council. I can arrange an introduction to Principal Gardner." Faith studied him with wary confusion. "Why would you do this for a complete stranger?" The question deserved an honest answer, though Archer wasn't entirely sure he understood his own motivations. After a moment's reflection, he replied, "Because 7 years ago, I arrived in this territory with nothing but determination and the clothes on my back. Someone gave me a chance when I needed it most. I'm merely passing along the favor." Their return to the ranch was conducted in thoughtful silence, Faith clearly processing the dramatic shift in her circumstances, Archer contemplating the implications of his offer of extended hospitality. As they approached the house, he finally broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he began, helping her down from the buggy with careful hands. "Mrs. Abernathy has been mentioning that the house needs a woman's touch, cataloging the library, organizing the pantry, that sort of thing. If you're willing, I could offer you temporary employment while you recover and seek a teaching position. Room, board, and a modest salary." Faith paused on the porch steps, turning to face him with an expression that mingled suspicion and relief. "That's very convenient timing for such a need to arise, Mr. Whitley." A slight smile tugged at his lips. "Perhaps, but the work is genuine, and it would allow you to maintain your independence while establishing yourself here." She considered this for a long moment before nodding. "On one condition." "Name it." "That you'll tell me honestly if my work is unsatisfactory, rather than maintaining the position out of charity." Archer extended his hand as if concluding a business arrangement. "You have my word, Miss Zimmerman." She placed her smaller hand in his, the gesture sealing an agreement that would alter both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. The following days established a rhythm to life at the Whitley Ranch that suited all parties. Faith, growing stronger with each passing day, devoted her mornings to assisting Mrs. Abernathy with household matters and her afternoons to organizing Archer's surprisingly extensive library, a collection accumulated through mail-order catalogs and occasional trips to Denver. For his part, Archer found himself increasingly aware of the young woman's presence in his home. It wasn't merely the physical changes, fresh flowers appearing on the dining table, curtains hanging differently to catch the light, but the subtle shift in atmosphere. Conversations at dinner extended beyond ranch business, touching on books they had both read, events in the wider world, and occasionally more personal reflections. A week after her arrival, Archer returned from town with news. "I've spoken with Principal Gardner," he announced as they gathered for the evening meal. "He's agreed to meet with you tomorrow regarding the teaching position." Faith's face lit with excitement. "Truly, oh, that's wonderful news." Her enthusiasm faltered slightly. "Though I have nothing appropriate to wear for an interview." Mrs. Abernathy, who had been serving the roast beef, spoke up. "The dressmaker finished altering your new dresses this morning. I was planning to collect them tomorrow, but we can go together earlier." The following day dawned clear and warm, a perfect late April morning. Archer, ostensibly occupied with ranch accounts at his desk, found himself watching through the window as Faith and Mrs. Abernathy departed for town in the buggy. Faith's anticipation was evident in her animated gestures as they drove away, and he found himself sharing her nervous energy. In the 3 hours they were gone, he accomplished precisely nothing, his thoughts circling repeatedly to the outcome of the interview. It was foolish, he told himself, to be so invested in a virtual stranger's professional prospects. Yet the possibility of her securing a position in Raton rather than moving on to another town produced an undeniable sense of relief. When the women finally returned, Faith's expression told him everything before she spoke. Her eyes sparkled with a joy that transformed her face, erasing the last traces of the desperate young woman who had collapsed on Porter's doorstep. "I got the position," she exclaimed, forgetting propriety in her excitement and grasping his hands. "I start next Monday. The school board approved it on Principal Gardner's recommendation." Archer found himself grinning back at her, infected by her happiness. "I never doubted it for a moment." "Congratulations, Miss Zimmerman. They're even providing accommodation," she continued. "There's a small cottage behind the school that teachers traditionally use. It needs some cleaning, but it will be perfect." "That's wonderful news," he replied, ignoring the unexpected pang of disappointment at the thought of her leaving his home. "Though of course you're welcome to stay here until the cottage is ready." That evening, their dinner took on a celebratory air with Mrs. Abernathy producing a special dessert and Archer opening a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a noteworthy occasion. As they sat on the porch afterward, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Faith grew reflective. "When I collapsed outside that store, I thought I had reached the end of my journey in every sense," she said quietly. "Instead, it was actually a beginning. I've never believed in fate, Mr. Whitley, but I'm starting to wonder if there might be something to it after all." Archer considered her words carefully before responding. "I'm not much for fate myself, but I do believe that how we respond to life's unexpected turns reveals our true character." He glanced at her profile, gilded by the fading light. "You've shown remarkable resilience, Miss Zimmerman." She turned to meet his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "Please, after all your kindness, I think you might call me Faith." "Faith," he repeated, the name feeling significant on his tongue. "Then you must call me Archer." The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken meaning, until Mrs. Abernathy's voice from inside the house broke the spell, announcing that she had prepared hot tea before retiring. The cottage behind the schoolhouse proved to require more than mere cleaning. When Archer accompanied Faith to inspect it 3 days before she was to begin teaching, they discovered a leaking roof, a door that wouldn't close properly, and evidence of field mice having taken up residence during its vacancy. "It's nothing that can't be fixed," Faith said with determined optimism, though her expression betrayed dismay at the state of what was to be her new home. Archer surveyed the space with a critical eye. "The roof needs immediate attention before the next rain. The rest can be addressed over time, but that won't wait." He turned to her, decision made. "I'll bring some of the ranch hands tomorrow to make repairs. In the meantime, you'll continue staying at my home." She began to protest, but he raised a hand to forestall her objections. "Consider it the town's investment in its new teacher. We can't have you catching pneumonia from a leaking roof before you've taught your first lesson." True to his word, Archer arrived the next morning with 2 of his most skilled workers and a wagon full of supplies. Faith, who had insisted on accompanying them despite his suggestion that she prepare for her classes, watched with fascination as they set to work with efficient precision. By mid-afternoon, the roof was sound, the door properly hung, and the most critical issues addressed. As his men packed up their tools, Archer found Faith standing in what would become her bedroom, a small space with a window that faced east to catch the morning light. "It's going to be lovely," she said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "I don't know how to thank you for all this." "Teach our children well," he replied simply. "That's thanks enough." She studied him with a searching gaze that seemed to peer beneath his customary reserve. "You care deeply about this community, don't you? It's not just about running your ranch." The observation caught him off guard with its accuracy. A man's obligations extend beyond his own property line, at least they should. "Is that why you never married?" she asked, then immediately flushed at her own boldness. "I'm sorry, that was terribly forward of me." Rather than taking offense, Archer found himself answering with unexpected candor. "Partly, I suppose. The ranch demanded everything in the early years, and later," he shrugged, "the right situation never presented itself." Faith nodded, her embarrassment fading. "I understand." In Philadelphia, there were expectations suitable matches arranged with suitable young men. But after my parents died, those connections dissolved. I found I preferred making my own way, even if it meant coming west alone. "Brave decision," he commented. She smiled wryly. "Or foolhardy, depending on one's perspective. But I've never regretted it, even when I was walking those miles from Zimmerman without food or water. At least my failures and successes are my own." The sentiment resonated deeply with Archer, who had chosen a similar path of self-determination. In that moment, he recognized in Faith something he had rarely encountered: a kindred spirit, who understood the value of independence without sacrificing compassion. Faith's first day of teaching marked another transition. That morning, as she prepared to leave for the schoolhouse, Archer presented her with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "A token for good luck," he explained as she opened it to reveal a beautiful fountain pen. "It's exquisite," she breathed, turning the polished instrument in her hands. "But far too expensive. Every teacher needs a proper writing instrument," he interrupted with a smile. "Consider it a professional necessity." The weeks that followed saw Faith fully embracing her role in the community. The children responded enthusiastically to her teaching methods, which combined traditional discipline with innovative approaches she had learned in Philadelphia. Parents remarked on their children's newfound enthusiasm for learning, and even Principal Gardner, initially skeptical of the young Eastern woman, became an outspoken advocate. Though she had moved into the cottage once it was properly repaired, Faith maintained her connection to the Whitley household. Sunday dinners became a tradition, with Archer collecting her after church services for an afternoon of conversation and Mrs. Abernathy's cooking. Occasionally, when school events required her presence in town after dark, Archer would appear with the buggy to escort her safely home, concerned about her walking alone despite Raton's relatively peaceful nature. It was during one such evening in late May, as they drove back to her cottage under a canopy of stars, that something shifted between them. They had been discussing a book they had both read, their conversation flowing easily as it always did, when Faith suddenly fell silent, gazing up at the brilliant display overhead. "I never saw stars like this in Philadelphia," she said softly. "The city lights obscured all but the brightest. Out here, it's as if the universe has opened itself completely." Archer followed her gaze upward, seeing the familiar sight anew through her eyes. "First time I saw a western sky at night, I couldn't sleep, kept thinking I was missing something important by closing my eyes." She laughed, the sound carrying in the still night air. "Exactly, it feels like an invitation. To what? To expansion, I suppose, to becoming more than we believed possible." She turned to look at him, her expression earnest in the moonlight. "Don't you feel it sometimes? That there are possibilities in this place that couldn't exist anywhere else?" The question stirred something in Archer that he had long kept carefully controlled, a yearning for connection that went beyond the comfortable camaraderie they had established. Before he could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much, they arrived at her cottage. As he helped her down from the buggy, her hand lingered in his longer than necessary, her eyes searching his face as if looking for an answer to an unasked question. "Thank you for the ride, Archer," she said finally, her voice carrying a note he hadn't heard before. "My pleasure, Faith. Good night." He waited until she was safely inside before turning the buggy toward home, his thoughts in uncharacteristic turmoil. For the first time in years, the solitude that awaited him felt less like peaceful independence and more like an absence. The turning point came unexpectedly, as such moments often do. On a sweltering afternoon in early June, Archer was returning from inspecting fence lines at the far edge of his property when he spotted a rider approaching at speed. Recognizing young Tommy Wilson, the blacksmith's son who often carried messages, he reined in his horse. "Mr. Whitley." The boy called before he'd fully stopped. "Miss Zimmerman sent me to find you. There's trouble at the school." Alarms surged through him. "What kind of trouble?" Men, 3 of them, came looking for her, said they knew her from before. "Miss Zimmerman told us children to run home and sent me to find you particular." The boy's face was flushed with excitement and fear. "They didn't look friendly, sir." Without waiting for further explanation, Archer spurred his horse toward town, cold dread settling in his stomach. The Zimmerman gang it had to be. They must have learned of Faith's survival and whereabouts. He reached the schoolhouse in record time, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped and taking the steps to the building in 2 strides. Inside, he found a scene that confirmed his worst fears. Faith stood backed against her desk, face pale but composed, confronted by 3 rough-looking men. Archer recognized the leader immediately: Ellis Blackwood, a notorious outlaw whose gang had been terrorizing the stagecoach lines for months. "Well, look who's arrived," Blackwood drawled, turning at the sound of Archer's entrance. "The hero of Raton." "This is a schoolhouse," Archer said evenly, though every muscle in his body was tensed for action. "You have no business here." Blackwood smiled unpleasantly. "That's where you're wrong, friend. We have unfinished business with the lovely teacher here." He gestured toward Faith. "She was a passenger on a coach we relieved of its burden some weeks back, survived against the odds, it seems." "And reported you to the marshal in Zimmerman," Faith added, her voice remarkably steady despite her evident fear. "Which I gather from your presence here means you're now being pursued by the law." One of the other men stepped forward menacingly. "Witnesses cause complications." "We aim to simplify our situation." Archer moved deliberately to place himself between Faith and the outlaws. "Not going to happen. You can ride out of town now while you still can, or face the consequences." Blackwood's hand drifted to his sidearm. Big talk for a man facing 3 guns. The tension in the room stretched taut as wire, the only sound the faint ticking of the schoolhouse clock. Archer was acutely aware of Faith behind him, of the danger she faced simply for having survived their previous encounter. "Last chance," Archer said quietly. "Leave now." "I don't think," Blackwood began, but his words were cut short by the crack of a rifle from the doorway. Marshal Jenkins stood there, his Winchester leveled at the outlaws. "Drop your weapons, gentlemen. You're surrounded." For a moment, it seemed Blackwood might risk a shootout, but a glance outside revealed several armed townsmen positioning themselves around the schoolhouse. With a curse, he slowly raised his hands, his companions reluctantly following suit. "This isn't over," he snarled at Faith as the marshal's deputies moved in to disarm and bind them. "Actually, it is," Jenkins replied. "The federal marshal from Santa Fe arrived this morning with warrants for your arrest. The Zimmerman stage line robbery was just the final straw. You're looking at a lengthy stay in territorial prison if you're lucky enough to avoid the hangman." As the outlaws were led away, Archer turned to Faith, who had maintained her composure admirably until now. With the danger past, she began to tremble visibly, and he stepped forward just in time to catch her as her knees buckled. "It's all right," he murmured, holding her steady. "They can't hurt you now." She leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I knew they might come eventually. When they robbed the coach, they seemed particularly interested in making sure there were no survivors who could identify them." Her voice faltered. "If you hadn't arrived when you did." "But I did," he said firmly, "and now it's truly over." The marshal approached them, hat in hand. "Miss Zimmerman, you'll need to give a formal statement, but it can wait until tomorrow if you're not up to it now." Faith straightened, composing herself with visible effort. "I can do it now, Marshal. I'd prefer to have it done with." Archer admired her resilience, even as concern for her well-being gnawed at him. "I'll accompany you," he said, in a tone that brooked no argument. The statement took less than an hour, Faith recounting the stagecoach robbery and her subsequent journey with clear, precise details that left no doubt about the outlaw's guilt. When they finally emerged from the marshal's office, The sun was setting, painting the street in gold and crimson. "I'll take you home," Archer said, guiding her to where his horse waited. She hesitated. "Actually, I don't think I want to be alone tonight. Would it be an imposition if I returned to the ranch with you, just for tonight?" The request, so contrary to her usual insistence on independence, told him more than words how deeply the confrontation had affected her. "Of course, Mrs. Abernathy will be delighted to have you." The ride to the ranch was conducted mostly in silence, Faith sitting before him on the saddle, her back against his chest. He could feel the gradual easing of tension in her body as the distance from town increased, her breathing becoming more regular, less shaky. Mrs. Abernathy, informed of the day's events, fussed over Faith like a mother hen, insisting on a hot bath and preparation of her old room. By the time they gathered for a late supper, Faith had regained much of her composure, though a lingering shadow remained in her eyes. "I keep thinking about what might have happened," she confessed as they sat together on the porch afterward, the night air cool against their skin. "Not just to me, but to any children who might have been there when they arrived. But it didn't happen," Archer reminded her gently. "And those men will face justice for their crimes." She nodded, drawing her shawl more tightly around her shoulders despite the mild evening. "I've always prided myself on self-reliance, on facing challenges without flinching. But today—" She looked up at him, vulnerability naked in her expression. "Today I was truly afraid, and I realized something important." "What was that?" he asked, his voice low. "That independence doesn't mean refusing to need others. That sometimes strength lies in acknowledging our connections." She hesitated, then continued more softly. "When I sent Tommy to find you, I never doubted you would come. Even before the marshal arrived, I felt safer simply knowing you were there." The admission stirred something profound in Archer's chest, a longing he had denied for longer than he cared to admit. "I will always come when you need me," he said, the words emerging as a promise rather than a mere reassurance. Faith's eyes widened slightly at his tone, and in the lantern light, he could see a flush rising to her cheeks. For a breathless moment, they regarded each other in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken possibility. Then, with deliberate movement, she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." That night, lying awake in his bed, Archer confronted the truth he could no longer ignore. What had begun as an act of simple human kindness toward a stranger in distress had evolved into something far more complex and powerful. Faith Zimmerman, with her quiet strength and luminous intelligence, had awakened feelings he had long ago resigned himself to never experiencing. The realization brought both clarity and apprehension. He was a man of the frontier, his hands roughened by ranch work, his education pieced together from borrowed books and hard experience. She was refined, educated, accustomed to the cultural advantages of Eastern civilization despite her embrace of Western life. Yet he could not dismiss the connection that had formed between them, a connection evident in their effortless conversations, in the way her face lit up when he entered a room, in the trust she had shown by turning to him in her moment of greatest fear. Morning found him resolved. Whatever her feelings might be, she deserved to know his. Pride and fear of rejection were poor reasons to remain silent when something so precious hung in the balance. Faith appeared at breakfast looking rested, the shadow of yesterday's terror largely dispelled. As they ate, she spoke animatedly about returning to school, determined not to allow the outlaw's intrusion to disrupt her students' education. "Principal Gardner suggested closing for a few days," she explained. "But I think routine is important, especially after something frightening occurs. The children need to see that life continues." "You're probably right," Archer agreed, "though no one would fault you for taking time to recover." She smiled, the expression warming her amber eyes. "I find that meaningful work is the best medicine for distress. Besides, being in that classroom makes me happy." The simple statement crystallized Archer's intentions. If he cared for her, truly cared for her, then her happiness must be his priority, whatever form it took. After breakfast, as he prepared to drive her back to town, Archer suggested a slight detour. "There's something I'd like to show you if you have time before school." Curious, Faith readily agreed, and he directed the buggy toward a ridge that overlooked both the town and his ranch. The vantage point offered a sweeping vista of the surrounding territory, the distant mountains, the ribbon of the river, the patchwork of settlements and rangeland. "It's breathtaking," Faith said as they stood together at the ridge's edge. "You can see everything from up here." "This is where I decided to stay," Archer told her. 7 years ago, I stood on this spot and knew this was where I wanted to build my life." He turned to face her directly. "I've never regretted that decision, but lately, I've come to realize that a life built alone has its limitations." Faith's expression grew very still, her eyes searching his face as she grasped the significance of his words. "Archer, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not a man who speaks easily about feelings. But yesterday, when I thought you might be harmed, I understood with perfect clarity what you've come to mean to me." He took a deep breath. "I care for you, Faith, deeply, more than I believed possible. And while I have no right to expect you might feel the same, but I do," she interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've tried to deny it, to remind myself that I came west to be independent, not to lose my heart to the first kind man I encountered. But you're not just kind, Archer. You're honorable, intelligent, steadfast, everything I've ever admired. How could I not come to care for you?" Joy surged through him, pure and powerful. Reaching out, he took her hands in his, drawing her slightly closer. "I don't want to interfere with the life you're building here. Your teaching, your independence, they're important," she smiled, squeezing his hands. "The wonderful thing about true independence is that it allows us to choose connection freely, without desperation or obligation. My feelings for you don't diminish me, they expand my life, just like the western sky expanded my vision of what's possible." The reference to their earlier conversation beneath the stars resonated deeply. With reverent care, Archer raised one hand to gently touch her cheek. "May I kiss you, Faith Zimmerman?" Her answer was to rise on tiptoes, closing the distance between them until their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of their shared future, tender at first, then deepening with the acknowledgement of feelings too long contained. When they finally parted, Archer kept his arms around her, unwilling to release her just yet. "I should warn you," he said with unaccustomed lightness, "that Mrs. Abernathy will be insufferably pleased with herself. She's been dropping hints about you for weeks." Faith laughed, the sound mingling with the morning breeze. "Has she now? And here I thought we were being so discreet with our feelings. Apparently not discreet enough to fool a determined housekeeper." He grew more serious. "Faith, I don't want to rush you. We can take this slowly, get to know each other properly." She considered this, then shook her head. "I think we've been getting to know each other properly since the day you carried me from Porter's doorstep. Some things don't require haste, but neither should they be unnecessarily delayed when both hearts are certain." The wisdom in her words struck him forcefully. Why indeed should they hesitate when life had already demonstrated its unpredictability and precious nature? "In that case," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "would you consider becoming my wife? Not immediately, I know you'll want to finish the school term and there are preparations to be made. But knowing that's our destination would make the journey all the sweeter." Faith's eyes filled with joyful tears. "Yes," she answered simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Archer Whitley." The school bell was ringing in the distance as they sealed this promise with another kiss, marking the hour, but also, it seemed to Archer, heralding the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. The news of their engagement spread through Raton with the speed that only small-town communication networks can achieve. By mid-afternoon, well-wishers were stopping by the schoolhouse to congratulate Faith, and Archer found himself receiving hearty backslaps and knowing grins from fellow ranchers and townspeople alike. Mrs. Abernathy, as predicted, was triumphant. "About time you recognized what was right in front of you," she informed Archer when he returned to the ranch that evening. "That girl's been good for you from the start." "You might have mentioned your observations earlier," he replied dryly. The housekeeper snorted. "Some things a man has to figure out for himself, makes him appreciate them more." They agreed on an August wedding, after the school term ended and before the fall roundup would demand Archer's full attention. Faith would continue teaching through the next school year, living at the ranch but riding to town each day, a compromise that honored both her professional commitment and their desire to begin their life together. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with preparations, some traditional, others uniquely suited to their circumstances. Faith invited her uncle from Santa Fe, receiving a warmly enthusiastic response that helped heal the earlier disappointment of his inability to help her. Archer wrote to his sister in Missouri, who promised to attend with her family, eager to meet the woman who had captured her brother's heart. One evening in late July, as they sat reviewing wedding plans, Faith grew thoughtful. "I've been considering something," she began hesitantly. "The cottage behind the school, it seems a shame to leave it vacant when housing is so scarce in town." Archer looked up from the list they'd been discussing. "What did you have in mind?" Principal Gardner mentioned that they've been trying to recruit another teacher, someone for the younger children, to allow me to focus on the older students, but the lack of housing has been an obstacle. She met his gaze directly. "I thought perhaps we might offer the cottage. It would help the school and ensure my replacement has suitable accommodation when I eventually—" She colored slightly. "When you eventually need time away to start our family," he finished for her, his heart warming at the thought. "I think it's an excellent idea." The gesture was characteristic of Faith, practical, generous, and forward-thinking. It was one of countless reasons he had fallen in love with her. Their wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the August heat tempered by a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers across the land. The ceremony was held at the town church, filled to capacity with what seemed like every resident of Raton and the surrounding countryside. Faith, radiant in a gown of ivory silk trimmed with lace, walked down the aisle on the arm of Archer's brother-in-law, having asked him to give her away in the absence of her father. Archer, watching her approach, felt a profound sense of gratitude that the twisted path of both their lives had somehow led to this shared destination. The reception that followed at the ranch was a joyous affair that lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed the county twice over, thanks to Mrs. Abernathy's exhaustive preparations and the contributions of neighbors. As twilight descended, the newly married couple slipped away from the celebration to share a quiet moment on the porch where they had first begun to recognize their feelings for each other. "Happy?" Archer asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Faith leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment evident in every line of her body. "Completely. Though I keep thinking about how differently everything might have turned out, if I hadn't collapsed exactly where and when I did, if you hadn't been the one to find me." "I prefer to think it was inevitable," he said, surprising himself with the sentiment. "Not fate exactly, but the natural outcome of two people who were looking for the same thing, even if they didn't know it yet." She smiled up at him. "And what were we looking for?" "Home," he answered simply. "Not just a place, but a feeling, security, belonging, the knowledge that you're exactly where you're meant to be." Faith reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw with tender appreciation. "I collapsed outside that general store believing I had lost everything. Instead, I found everything I never knew I wanted." The music from the reception drifted to them on the evening air, mingling with the chorus of night insects and the distant lowing of cattle. Tomorrow would begin the practical reality of their married life, with its inevitable challenges and adjustments. But for now, in this perfect moment, Archer held his wife close and savored the miraculous truth that the woman who had once been a stranger in desperate need had become the very center of his world. 5 years later, June 1890, the schoolhouse door burst open, releasing a flood of children into the warm afternoon sunshine. Last to emerge was Faith Whitley, a leather satchel in one hand and her 3-year-old son's hand firmly clasped in the other. "Careful on the steps, Daniel," she cautioned, as the energetic boy attempted to leap down all three at once. "Papa," Daniel called, spotting the tall figure waiting beside a wagon at the edge of the schoolyard. Breaking free of his mother's grasp, he raced toward Archer, who scooped him up with practiced ease. "How's my boy?" Archer asked, settling his son on his shoulders. "Did you help Mama teach today?" "I drawed all the letters," Daniel announced proudly. "And Miss Morley said I was the best counter in the little class." Faith joined them, smiling at her husband as he leaned down to kiss her in greeting. "He certainly keeps Miss Morley on her toes," she confirmed, referring to the young teacher who now occupied what had once been Faith's cottage. "Though I think she secretly enjoys having the ranch owner's son as her most enthusiastic pupil." Archer helped Faith into the wagon before placing Daniel between them on the seat. "Last day of term finished successfully." "Indeed," she replied as they began the familiar journey home. "Though I admit I'm looking forward to a summer without lesson plans." Her hand drifted unconsciously to her abdomen, where the slightest curve was just beginning to show beneath her dress. Archer noticed the gesture and covered her hand with his own. "How are you feeling today?" "Much better than yesterday. Dr. Miller says this time should be easier than with Daniel." She leaned slightly against his shoulder. "And I have a far better understanding of what to expect." The pregnancy, confirmed just a month earlier, had been received with joy by the entire household. Daniel, though not fully comprehending the concept of a sibling, had already designated a corner of his room for the baby's things, a gesture that had brought tears to Faith's eyes. As they approached the ranch, evidence of 5 years' prosperity was visible in the expanded buildings, the well-maintained fences, and the healthy cattle grazing in the distance. Archer had added a wing to the house after their marriage, creating a spacious family area with a nursery that had initially been Daniel's domain and would soon welcome a new occupant, Mrs. Abernathy, who had adamantly refused Archer's offer of retirement when he married, remained a fixture in their home, though she had graciously ceded control of the household to Faith while maintaining her role as cook and self-appointed guardian of family traditions. "Mr. Porter asked after you today," Faith mentioned as they approached the house. "He's received those books you ordered from Chicago." Archer nodded. "I'll ride into town tomorrow to collect them." The volume's advanced texts on cattle breeding and range management represented his ongoing commitment to improving his operation through education, a value Faith had reinforced in him. Daniel, spotting his favorite ranch hand near the barn, began squirming impatiently. "Can I go see Mr. Rodriguez? He said he'd show me how to tie a special rope knot." After receiving permission from both parents and strict instructions to stay within sight of the barn, the boy scrambled down and ran off, his energy seemingly inexhaustible. "He becomes more like you every day," Faith observed, accepting Archer's hand to descend from the wagon. "The same determination, the same curiosity about how things work. With your intelligence and compassion," Archer added, drawing her close for a moment. "A fortunate combination, I'd say." That evening, after Daniel had been tucked into bed with stories and prayers, Faith and Archer sat together on the porch that had become their special place for quiet conversation away from the bustle of ranch life. The tradition had begun during their courtship and continued through marriage, parenthood, and the various challenges they had faced together. "I received a letter from the Territorial Education Board today," Faith said, breaking a comfortable silence. "They've asked me to join a committee developing standardized curricula for rural schools." Archer's face lit with pride. "That's wonderful news. Your reputation as an innovative teacher has clearly spread." She nodded, pleased but thoughtful. "It would mean some travel to Santa Fe for meetings, probably starting this fall." Her hand again moved to her abdomen. "The timing isn't ideal with the baby coming in December. We'll make it work," he assured her. "Mrs. Abernathy would be delighted to have more time with the children, and I can certainly manage my schedule to accommodate yours." He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Your work is important, Faith. I wouldn't want you to refuse this opportunity." The support was characteristic of their partnership. From the beginning, Archer had viewed Faith's teaching not as a temporary occupation until motherhood, as many men might have, but as an essential part of who she was. In turn, she had embraced ranch life wholeheartedly, learning to ride expertly, helping with the books, and developing a genuine appreciation for the land that had become her home. "I've been thinking about that day," Faith said softly, her mind evidently following a similar path to his own. "When I collapsed outside Porter's store, I was so close to giving up." Archer turned to look at her, still struck by her beauty after all their years together. "What kept you going those last few miles? You never really told me." She considered the question carefully. "Stubbornness, partly. I'd come so far already, but also hope, I suppose. Not hope for anything specific, just a stubborn belief that if I could reach the next town, something would change." Her smile held a touch of wonder. "I had no idea how completely my life would transform, for both of us," he acknowledged. The solitary rancher who had carried an unconscious stranger to safety had been irrevocably changed by that act of compassion. His carefully ordered existence expanded to include love, family, and a depth of happiness he had never imagined possible. As darkness settled around them, the familiar sounds of the ranch at night created a soothing backdrop to their conversation. In the distance, a coyote called, the sound echoing across the land that had witnessed their journey from strangers to lovers to partners in the fullest sense. "We should go in," Faith said eventually, though she made no move to rise. "Tomorrow comes early, especially with Daniel's energy." Archer smiled, remembering countless similar evenings over the years. "A few more minutes won't hurt," he said, drawing her closer against the cooling night air. Together they sat, watching the stars emerge above the land they both loved, their shared silence containing all the understanding that had grown between them since that fateful day when hunger and desperation had brought Faith Zimmerman to the doorstep of Porter's General Store, and Archer Whitley had carried her home for good.